sacrifice to themselves. It was, they felt, Britain that owed America a debt of gratitude.
In America, war had been good for business. Recovery from depression, kick-started by the Keynesian-influenced New Deal, had been boosted by defense contracts and war production. During the war years, America's GDP had more than doubled. By 1945, it was boom time. As one Labour MP put it that same year, if a dozen British housewives lived in the United States for a month, ate their food, saw their shops bulging with goods of all kinds, and then came back here, they would start a revolution. In September 1945, less than 1 month after the end of the Second World War, Keynes arrived in Washington, D.C., the only place in the world with the cash to bail out bankrupt Britain. He was under no illusion that this would be easy. $5 billion was an awful lot of money in anyone's book. But Keynes was carrying his trump card, justice.
If there's one thing that I learned as ambassador here, it is that sentiment alone cuts little ice when negotiating with Americans. However strong, however sincerely felt, it is rarely enough when hard national interests come into play. In this town, just as in Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, and elsewhere, hard-nosed self-interest trumps warm feelings every time. It's a universal law of diplomacy, and America is no exception. So, Keynes was on dicey ground when he came to Washington to play the justice card.
On September the 13th, 1945, Keynes and his American counterparts met at the Federal Reserve. But Keynes was suffering from a serious heart condition. His pilot had even been ordered to fly especially low to avoid straining his passenger's heart.
As the American negotiator greeted this eminent British economist, their first impressions must have reinforced a growing American view of Britain. Once great, now old, and past its prime.
Inside, Keynes, brilliant, arrogant, with a cut-glass accent, was on the back foot from the very start. From across the table, he would hear Britain described as a bankrupt company whose major creditors needed to be paid first. And he must have been surprised to hear himself described in Congress as one of the leaders of world communism. Being a grand emissary from Attlee's socialist Britain wasn't going to help get justice. Americans didn't want their dollars to help build a socialist utopia. I'm going to try out Keynes's justice pitch on some of the toughest Americans I know. My first sparring partner is a former Deputy Secretary of State under President George W. Bush.
Whoa, pardon me.
How are you?
Welcome back.
Very, very good to see you. How you doing?
Good to
How you
see you.
doing?
I'm
Very,
fine.
very good to see you.
Rich Armitage is a former U.S. naval officer, a Vietnam vet, and ex-wrestler.
All right. Rich, let's go back 60 years to the situation immediately after the end of the Second World War. And I come from London, and I'm saying to you, look, I'm a close ally, and we in Britain, like you, have emerged victorious, except we're devastated. We're bankrupt. We have no more money. We're in dire straits. What we need is money. We need a grant. We need something without strings in the name of justice. So, are you going to pay up, please?
I don't think so. I think we'd have answered, in fact, we did answer, that we've given you something more valuable than money.
I represent a country which has stood shoulder to shoulder with you in defeating fascism.
We sacrificed to many of our youth, notwithstanding the even greater sacrifice that Great Britain has had.
But economically, you're in a far better condition. So we're turning to you for help, particularly as, before you came into the war under President Roosevelt, for a while we stood alone in fighting fascism.
I think there was a great recognition here that this just wasn't a matter of building up Great Britain, that we had an entire continent that was devastated.
Rich was giving me short shrift. After all, in September 1945, American politicians felt they had done their bit.
It wasn't something that immediately was obvious to the members of the U.S. Congress who had just spent billions of dollars of the U.S. Treasury in the support of this war.
So when a team turns up from London and starts to make an appeal to you almost on the basis of morality and natural justice, this is going to rub you up the wrong way.
Yeah, I think it would have rubbed us the wrong way.
Do you think that John Maynard Keynes, a rather elitist, old Etonian, very, very traditional British kind of guy, compounded the error of conveying a message like that to the United States?
If he was somewhat arrogant in his presentation, or elitist, as you'd say, then that would not have gone down well in the United States, which was also feeling quite bruised, having fought on both fronts during the Second World War.
In the balance, you have national interest, you have some sense of sentiment towards the United Kingdom. But at the end of the day, it's the national interest, is it not, that really calls the shots?
It was a cold calculation of national security. We don't, the Great Britain wouldn't want, and we don't get involved in charity per se. The cold calculation was that we had to spend some serious time on our own domestic situation, our own domestic economy, and our society to try to heal the fissures that existed during our war. Listen, there are no ebullience after the sacrifice of so much treasure and so many lives, but there was satisfaction that we'd prevailed. My own father was in the Pacific during the war, and he wanted nothing more than to get back and start rebuilding his life. And I think that's a generally good sort of signpost for all Americans. We want to get back and concentrate on ourselves for a while.
This justice pitch is playing badly. Let's take it to the very top.
I'm at the West Wing of the White House, and I'm about to see Karl Rove, perhaps the most important political advisor in the Western world.
My rendezvous with Rove is in the White House TV studio itself, where presidents give their carefully calibrated fireside chats to the American people. It's Karl, the world's master political strategist, who pitches these messages just right. A Gallup poll from 1945 showed 60% of Americans were against a loan.
How are you?
How are you?
Good to see you,
Very
sir. How are you?
good to see you.
Happy holidays.
And to you as well.
Karl, John Maynard Keynes arrives on a government mission in Washington in late 1945, and he's coming for money, and he thinks he's going to get a grant. Immediately, there's a ferocious resistance from a number of congressmen. We have just what kind of saps do they, the British, think we are? And another congressman talks of Keynes as being one of the arch leaders of world communism. And where's all this stuff coming from? And does it represent the feelings of the American people?
Well, it represents in the immediate aftermath of World War II a substantial slice of American opinion. The war had seen the national debt absolutely skyrocket. The idea of a $5 billion grant, which at that time was an extraordinary sum of money, to their wartime ally that had just voted out America's great wartime friend, Winston Churchill, and replaced him with this sort of dangerous sounding, labor government, just made the isolationists and the conservatives, particularly in the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party, very, very nervous.
He makes what he calls the justice argument, which is that you morally owe us, the Brits, a grant in aid because we were in the war longer than you were and have suffered more grievously than you did.
There is a palpable sense in America in late 1945 and early 1946 that we have done our part. So there are all these domestic issues that are crying out for the attention of the American government, and it is impossible for Truman to contemplate giving a gift. It's one thing to say, I'm going to make a loan, so in essence I'm loaning them money and we're going to get it back. It's another thing to say, after all that has happened in this war, we're going to give them a big sum of money while lots of needs go unmet here at home.
What advice would you have given to the British government on what their pitch should realistically be?
First, to make it clear that it was in America's economic interest to do so. This was a way to sort of create international economic growth. Second of all, this was a way in which America could get a fairer deal on the international stage vis-a-vis Britain. And thirdly, it was to strengthen the American economy directly, that we'd get paid back, that this was a good investment.
I'm so all alone, ever so lonely. I'm so all alone, ever so blue.
Keynes palpably couldn't deliver on his promise of justice, and London was gunning for him. To make matters worse, his health was failing. In October 1945, now not only battling the Americans, but also facing savage criticism from his own government, Keynes complained in a letter home of heart symptoms which were due to overeating on top of overworking.
The truth was, Keynes had suffered a heart attack. What an impossible situation. The Americans stabbing you in the front, your own government stabbing you in the back, and worst of all, you realize that you cannot deliver on what you have promised. Every diplomatic envoy's worst nightmare.
I know just how he felt.
My worst nightmare came in the autumn of 2002. I was talking to Scooter Libby, Vice President Cheney's Chief of Staff, Hawk of Hawks in the Bush administration, and it dawned on me as never before that it was going to be the devil's own job to stop the UN Security Council fracturing over Iraq. And from then on, it was like watching a train crash in slow motion.
Throughout the autumn of 1945, Keynes sent London telegram after telegram, telling them his justice mission had failed. It never pays to be the bearer of bad tidings. In Whitehall, messengers are riddled with shot every day. As he digested the news from Keynes in Washington, Hugh Dalton, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, must have felt his own heart skip a beat or two. Where was the money to rebuild a braver and better post-war Britain to come from?
They were living in a world of fantasy if they thought they were going to get the terms from the Americans that Keynes had first led them to expect. I mean, for Dalton, it must have been a body blow, for Attlee, a body blow, for any member of the cabinet who understood it, a body blow. But they had great difficulty in coming to terms with reality, which was that the Americans did not feel under any compelling moral obligation to bail them out of the full financial consequences of the problems after the war.
From Washington, the ailing Keynes didn't mince his words.
We are in negotiation in Washington. Repeat, Washington. Some fig leaves which may pass muster with old ladies in London wilt in a harsher climate.
Wilt in a harsher climate. If a civil servant had said that to you, what would you, even with Keynes's reputation, what would you say?
Oh, well, I'd have been furious, of course.
And your fury might have led to what?
Oh, I might have sacked him.
Keynes, on the best of health by then, was left white, shaking with rage and near to resigning, according to one observer. It's not the best atmosphere for a negotiation of this kind.
He's obviously shaking with rage, thinking the Chancellor's taken leave of his senses. Who is this patronising idiot telling me to get these terms I can't get? Meanwhile, Dalton is sitting at home very angry, thinks he's been very let down, and that why doesn't Keynes understand he's got to get somewhere near to the original proposition. Oh. Keynes, I say, not being a very modest man, he was well aware of his own intellectual grandeur, was obviously beginning to think he was dealing with two sets of idiots.
Number 11 eventually told Number 10 that justice was off the table. On November the 6th, 1945, Attlee summoned the full cabinet so they could all choose between the remaining two options, starvation or temptation. That's signing up to a mortgage which would take at least 50 years to pay off.